order. We now have questions. Secretary of State for Scotland. I call Kirsten Oswald.
Question 1, please, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, this is an incredibly significant week for the whole planet as countries from around the world gather in Glasgow to negotiate on climate action. We're facing a climate emergency with no time to lose, and we must keep 1.5 alive. I'm sure the whole House will join me in urging all countries at COP to make a real commitment to change. And I know we will all want to take this opportunity to thank Police Scotland for working so hard to ensure a safe and secure COP26. They are supported in this by 7,000 police officers from other UK forces. Mr. Speaker, I'm very pleased that the UK government has brought COP26 to Glasgow, and I'm sure the city will receive a long-term boost from being in the world spotlight. Turning to question 1, the UK government has agreed a deal with the EU which fully delivers for Scotland and the rest of the UK. Our deal provides Scottish businesses with exceptional access to EU markets. It is the first time the EU has ever agreed a zero-tariff, zero-quota deal. And, Mr. Speaker, I regret that the SNP refused to support that deal.
Kirsten Oswald.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Brexit-induced labour shortages are actually having a real impact on several sectors of the Scottish economy, with social care, hospitality and food and drink amongst the worst hit. And for some, the impact has been catastrophic, with up to a third of Scotland's harvest of some crops left to rot in the fields. These are the direct consequences of this UK government's hard Brexit deal and their ideological decision to abruptly end freedom of movement. The Secretary of State knows that, and he knows the EU provided over €1 billion in Brexit support to Ireland. So will he back Scotland's employers and support a compensation fund to mitigate the Brexit damage inflicted upon Scotland against our will?
Well, the Honourable Lady will know that I backed this increase of the Seaside Agricultural Workers Scheme from 2,500 to 30,000, and NFU Scotland are well aware of that I led on those negotiations. She will know the EU Settled Status Scheme has been successful. We were told less than 3 million people would apply, but in fact over 6 million have applied. But some of those workers have remained in their countries. They can come to the EU freely, as you know, but they remained there during the pandemic, and the pandemic's been a factor. We also have the shortage occupation list, which creates lower salary requirements for skilled workers. So this government's doing everything it can, but we have to recognise there is a pandemic effect on labour shortages at the moment.
David Mundell.
The Secretary of State will be aware that the principal export market for most businesses in my constituency is in England. Does he share my frustration that the Scottish Government, rather than supporting those businesses with exports to other parts of the United Kingdom, continue to pursue an independence agenda which could only mean more barriers for those businesses?
Well, my right honourable friend is absolutely spot on with the remarks he makes. Scotland's trade with the rest of the UK is 3 times more than her trade with Europe. It's worth over £50 billion, it's worth over 500,000 jobs, and it's absolutely critical that we keep the border open.
We have now the SNP spokesperson, Murray Black.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Now, the Minister will remember that Scotland voted to remain part of the European Union. Correct. And that despite every compromise offered, this government ploughed ahead with knowing full well the damage that it would do to Scotland and that it was against the wishes of the people in Scotland. Now the OBR has projected that the UK's economy will be 4% lower because of Brexit. And HMRC found that Scottish exports were actually higher last year during the height of the pandemic than they are this year after Brexit. So I know that he mentioned the pandemic, but this means that Brexit is having a worse impact on Scottish exports than the pandemic has. So although he could fool me with his lack of maths, Mr. Speaker, I'm going to presume that the Minister's not in favour of the pandemic and its effects. So given that the effects of Brexit are worse, why does he support it?
Well, the Honourable Lady quotes the OBR. The OBR prediction actually was for economic growth to be 4% in March. The reality is they have corrected that prediction now for economic growth to be 6.5% in 2021 and 6% in 2022. And actually our economy is recovering strongly and is the fastest growing economy in the G7.
Murray Black.
Speaker, this alternative reality is an international embarrassment. Now, as my honourable member has already mentioned, we know that the EU have provided over €1 billion to Ireland as a Brexit compensation fund to combat the effects. So since we know that Brexit is damaging Scotland's economy, and since this place clearly thinks itself so superior to the EU, without mentioning existing funds, can the Minister tell us when Scotland will receive its Brexit compensation fund and how much will be in it?
We've just had a budget where the Chancellor has given £41 billion in the block grant, up £4.6 billion, the largest ever block grant the Scottish Government received since devolution began, since 1998, the largest ever block grant. On top of that, this week, almost £200 million in structural fund support through the Levelling Up Fund, the Community Renewal Fund, the Community Ownership Fund. More money going into Scotland than ever before to support Scotland as we go through the pandemic. And it's a matter of enormous regret, Mr. Speaker, that last night, when the budget vote took place, the SNP didn't support all that extra funding for Scotland.
Douglas Ross.
Speaker, the EU announced earlier on this week that it would be removing the tariffs on American whisky in a further de-escalation of the trade dispute between the US and the EU. Clearly, there has already been positive news for the Scotch whisky industry for the 5-year suspension, but would the Secretary of State work with me to encourage the UK Government to remove all the tariffs on American whisky, which would further support the distillers in Murray and the industry across Scotland?
Well, my honourable friend makes a very good point. I know in his constituency of Murray there are over 40 distilleries. I understand why he feels very strongly about it. I agree with him. We were successful taking the 25% tariff away, but it needs to be removed completely, not just suspended for a number of years. And the way to do that is also for us to remove our tariffs on bourbon. So I'd be very happy to meet with him to discuss that.
Sharp. Mr. Speaker, the Brexit has been nothing other than an unmitigated disaster for Scotland. We now have food shortages, labour shortages, businesses unable to export their products, and we now have food rotting in the fields. Isn't it about time, instead of all this mealy-mouthed nonsense, he gets to his feet and apologises to the people of Scotland for dragging our nation out of the European Union against its national collective will?
I simply don't recognise what the honourable gentleman said. We've been through a pandemic, and it's far too early to say what any impacts are to make predictions. But what we know is our economy is growing, we're doing fantastic trade deals around the world, and they're going to benefit the Scottish economy, Scottish food and drink. And he just needs to get positive about that. Stop talking down Scotland's businesses. Stop talking down Scotland and start to get optimistic about the opportunities that we face.
Can I just gently say to ministers, it's meant to go through the chair. I know it's becoming a very personal battle, and I'm trying to not allow that. Andrew Bauer.
Question number 2, sir.
Mr.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My department continues to work closely with the Scottish fishing industry. Following the success of our Scottish Seafood Exports Task Force, which made real progress on issues identified by industry, we are continuing to bring together industry and ministers through our Scottish Seafood Industry Action Group to continue that productive engagement.
Andrew Bauer.
I thank my honourable friend for that answer. As a newly independent coastal state seeking this week to negotiate with Norway, get an agreement on Arctic cod, what is my honourable friend doing to break the monopoly of foreign-owned and rather slyly named UK fisheries, which has had more than its fill from Svalbard and has for decades fleeced the Scottish fishing industry over the UK quota on Arctic cod?
My honourable friend makes an important point. I'm well aware of the representations which the catching sector in Scotland has made over quotas it has lost while we were part of the common fisheries policy. That saw Scottish quota swap for the benefit of a foreign-owned vessel. I'm sure that being an independent coastal state must mean that we look after our truly domestic businesses first and foremost.
Mr. Carmichael.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hope the Minister is aware that the next few weeks will be the most important weeks of the year for businesses exporting fish to continental Europe, and nothing should be done that will affect confidence in the reliability of supply from these shores. These are the same people who were absolutely hammered in the first week of the year as the consequence of the shambolic start to the year. They were promised compensation by DEFRA at that stage. I've spoken to one supplier in Shetland who has been told that if he had allowed his fish to rot in the quayside, he would have got full compensation. But because he sold it at a significant discount in the domestic market, he will get nothing. Surely that's not how it was supposed to work.
Well, I'm grateful for the honourable gentleman for raising that point. If he cares to send me the details of that firm, I'll certainly follow it up with my colleagues in DEFRA and make sure that the scheme has been working as it should have been.
Sir Rutherford.
Question number 3, Mr. Speaker.
With permission, Mr. Speaker, I'll answer questions 3 and 13 together. The UK Government's commitment to shipbuilding in Scotland is unwavering. Over the past 15 years, we have delivered 6 Type 45 destroyers launched from the Clyde, 2 aircraft carriers assembled at Rosyth, 5 offshore patrol vessels built on the Clyde, and we've ensured a bulging order book for the future. 8 Type 26 frigates ordered, with 3 of them already under construction on the Clyde, and 5 Type 31 frigates ordered and destined for Rosyth.
I'm pleased that the first steel has been cut for the Type 31 frigate HMS Venturer being built at Rosyth, with the fleet's construction due to support 1,250 jobs plus 150 apprenticeships. Would my honourable friend agree with me that projects such as these are integral to the Union?
Well, I absolutely agree, Mr. Speaker. The shipbuilding industry makes a huge contribution to strengthening the Union, directly supports UK security and prosperity, but it also supports 25,200 jobs across the UK and 7,000 direct jobs in Scotland. And, Mr. Speaker, I was fortunate to recently visit BAE Systems in Govan, and I met the excellent workforce building HMS Glasgow, and I'm assured she'll be a very fine ship.
Wonderful. Jack LaPlesta.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does my honourable friend share my disappointment that Scotland's state-owned shipyard could not even compete for a Scottish ferry building contract? And does he note that this Scottish Government's failure may cost many shipbuilding jobs?
I do share my honourable friend's disappointment that the Scottish Government-owned shipyard was unable to compete in the tenders for 2 new ferries for Scotland. And that disappointment is shared by the whole of Scotland, in particular our island communities, who are suffering every day as a result of the SNP's self-inflicted ferry fiasco.
Alan Brown.
Mr. Speaker, the Orbital O2 tidal generator was the first marine vessel launched from Dundee in 40 years. Waving Tidal offers massive opportunities for the wider maritime industry in Scotland. All that is required for these technologies to scale up is to have a ring-fenced pot of money and the forthcoming contracts for reference auction. Will the Secretary of State do everything in his power to liaise with bees to make sure this happens? And I'd be happy to meet with them.
Yes and yes.
We now consider Minister Chris Elmore.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. In 2019, the Scottish Government took shipbuilding company Fergus Marine into public ownership. The yard was supposed to deliver 2 ferries by the end of 2019 at a cost of £97 million. The ferries still haven't been delivered, and the total cost has ballooned to more than double the original budget, leaving islanders without new ferries and taxpayers footing the bill. As we've just heard, now, rather than using the shipbuilder to build more ferries, they are sending the contracts abroad to create jobs in other countries. So does the Secretary of State think this represents value for money for Scottish and UK taxpayers? And if he doesn't, will he raise this issue with Scottish ministers, because taxpayers really do deserve better?
The honourable gentleman makes a very good point. The Scottish Government's incompetence in this area has cost the taxpayer very, very heavily indeed. 11 organisations responded to the original procurement process, and the 3 chosen to tender were shipyards in Romania, Poland and Turkey. And, Mr. Speaker, I would have preferred the Scottish Government to show some loyalty to UK shipyards, even if their own one couldn't fulfil this contract.
Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This government is continuing to work collaboratively with counterparts in the devolved administrations on issues affecting seed potato growers. We remain in close contact with the main industry bodies, and we continue to press the European Commission to allow imports of our high-class seed potatoes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The EU continues to block seed potato exports into Europe. It offers no reciprocal trading arrangements, And, of course, this is harming not only the vital industry in Scotland, but also my growers, Solana Seeds in North Norfolk. Will my right honourable friend agree to meet with me to explain the situation further and what we're doing to rectify this problem?
Yeah. I'd be very happy to meet my honourable friend, Mr. Speaker. I can tell him that an application has been submitted to the EU to lift the restrictions based on recognising GB seed potato requirements as equivalent, which has been pursued at both political and technical levels. We remain committed to finding a solution to allow exports to resume and will continue to press our case with the Commission. In the meantime, the temporary authorisation that allowed imports of seed potatoes from the EU expired on the 30th of June.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I mean, this is basically just another example of the botched Brexit deal failing to take into account the needs of a small but very important industry. The industry has now completely collapsed. 30,000 tonnes of seed haven't been exported. £13.5 million of trade is no longer in place. What is the Minister doing to actually ensure that an equivalence deal is reached with the EU as soon as possible so that the trade can be resumed?
Well, Mr. Speaker, in addition to the points I made in the answer to my honourable friend, I would point out to the honourable lady that there is enormous export potential right round the world, particularly in China and Asia, further in Asia, for Scottish seed potato exports. This is something I discussed with industry in Glasgow on Monday evening. There is huge potential there, and we will do everything we can to help them realise that.
Sarah Britley.
Question number 5, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Our UK-wide total DWP spend on the labour market support will increase to more than £6 billion. This will give everyone a chance to progress work and develop the skills they need for the modern workforce. In Scotland, we have made available over 15,000 jobs, and around 8,000 jobs have already started.
Sarah Britley.
Well, to fulfil their potential is key to levelling up opportunity. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that the UK-wide Kickstart scheme, which has made available well over 10,000 Scottish placements, is yet another example of the UK government delivering for the people of Scotland?
Yeah. I absolutely agree with my honourable friend, and if I can loop this back to earlier questions on labour market issues, I hope that these schemes that this government is putting forward will help give the next generation the skills to fill these domestic vacancies.
Secretary of State Ian Murray.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A proper plan for jobs, of course, would have Scottish renewables at its heart. There are 4 simple steps the Minister could take today to unleash this proper plan potential. Firstly, persuade the Treasury to create a pot dedicated to tidal energy in the 4th Contracts for Difference auction. Secondly, instruct Ofgem to reform transmission charges to stop disadvantaging Scotland. Thirdly, fund the energy interconnectors from the island generators to the mainland. And, of course, fourthly, back the Acorn carbon capture and storage project. These government decisions would not only transform the UK energy sector, but create a Scottish jobs legacy from COP26. So will the Minister demand that his Cabinet colleagues act now to create a proper jobs plan for Scotland?
Well, I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman. He does raise the important issue that Scotland in particular has enormous potential in the renewable sector, particularly on Acorn. I can reassure him that project is not dead. It didn't get through to the first 2, but is a reserve project, and we will be working closely to make sure it is in a future one. Through my department, we are funding a number of renewable energy schemes, like CORE in East Ayrshire, and he referenced tidal in particular in the Orkney Islands. That can form part of the island's growth deal. More generally, I'd be very happy to facilitate a meeting with my colleagues in Bays so he can discuss the wider issues.
Ian Murray.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would certainly accept a meeting with the Secretary of State at Bays to go over these issues, but I would have thought that the Minister and the Scotland Office would also want to champion these, because if one of the outcomes of COP is quite clear, it's we need action and not just words. Mr. Speaker, the Chancellor's budget last week didn't have a plan for jobs in it either. In fact, he barely mentioned it. The conclusion, despite paying more, Scottish taxpayers are getting much less after a decade of devastating Tory and SNP austerity. It's no plan for jobs to be increasing taxes on businesses and hard-working people at a time when households and businesses are struggling with rapidly rising costs. So can I ask the Minister, is he comfortable, and is his department comfortable, as a Conservative Minister, that under his government, hard-working Scots now face the highest tax burden since the 1950s?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, firstly, in the income tax that the Scottish Government is responsible, it is indeed true that they have higher taxes than the rest of the UK, and I'll leave them to take that up with the Scottish Government. But on the wider point he made about unemployment and employment, if he casts his mind back to the budget last week, the forecasts for unemployment after the pandemic were originally for about 12%. It's going to be less than half that. Yeah. And through the changes my right honourable friend, the Chancellor, are making to universal credit tapers, for example, that will leave more money in the hands of hard-working people.
Ben Everett.
6, sir.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Turing Scheme has provided funding for more than 40,000 participants from schools, colleges and universities across the UK to study and work around the globe during this academic year. Education providers in Scotland have received more than £8.2 million in funding under the schemes.
Ben Everett.
As one of two members of Parliament representing Milton Keynes in this place, I'm particularly proud that the scheme is named after one of our local heroes, Alan Turing. Can my right honourable friend and neighbour confirm to me that this scheme will continue to seek global opportunities for our students and hope that we can inspire the next generation of code breakers? And will he join me in welcoming the fact that there are 28 successful applicants for Scottish projects and £7.9 million for those Scottish projects this year?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I could absolutely agree with my honourable and close friend in Milton Keynes. It is a matter of pride that the scheme is named after Alan Turing, and the work that he did to help the globe, I think, is entirely fitting that our global scheme, which goes way beyond the horizons of Erasmus, is proving such a success. And I'm happy to confirm to him that in my right honourable friend, the Chancellor's budget announcement last week, the funding will be provided to deliver this scheme for another 3 years.
Greg Smith.
7, sir.
Mr. Speaker, I have frequent conversations with Cabinet colleagues about maintaining and strengthening the devolution settlement and ensuring that the Government's focus is on delivering for Scotland. It is important that all legislation clearly reflects the competence and roles of Scotland's two parliaments and two governments.
Greg Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would my right honourable friend agree with me that the key issue here is for the Scottish Government to exercise its existing powers more effectively rather than asking for new ones or seeking to go outside the realms of the Scotland Act?
As my honourable friend will know, we routinely engage with the Scottish Government regarding the use of devolved powers. It is in the interests of citizens across the UK that both governments operate within their respective powers as set out in the Scotland Act 1998. And that is why, Mr. Speaker, I flagged to the Deputy First Minister back in March that I felt the UNCRC and the ECLSG bills contained sections that were outside the competence of the Scottish Government. Sadly, our warnings and suggestions for changes to the bills were ignored, and so our law officers referred the relevant sections of the bills to the Supreme Court. Mr. Speaker, the Supreme Court agreed with our view on every count. I hope that the Scottish Government will, in future, work with us to ensure that their bills respect the devolution settlement so that we do not waste any more time and money when enacting important legislation.
Gaskell.
Mr. Speaker.
This government, Mr. Speaker, is committed to transitioning the economy to net zero by 2050. We recently published our net zero strategy, which will support hundreds of thousands of well-paid jobs and leverage up to £90 billion of private investment by 2030 across the entire UK.
Opportunities must be local as well as large-scale projects such as turbine manufacturing that Scotland's sadly missing out on. but local communities such as my own in East Lothian are denied a share of the wealth flowing ashore. There's a legislative gap to allow community benefit for onshore as opposed to offshore as opposed to onshore wind. Will the Minister meet with me to discuss this, to see if East Lothian and other such communities can benefit from offshore wind, as Shetland has benefited from oil and gas?
Well, I'm always happy to meet the honourable gentleman, but I would point out to him that this government is investing heavily in offshore wind, including announcements made this week by my right honourable friend.
David Owen. Speaker, clearly Scotland has a lot to offer, not least in its high-quality wind, the net zero objectives. But can my honourable friend confirm that the Acorn, CCUS and hydrogen project is still very much part of the UK Government's plans for overall CCUS strategy and our objectives to meet net zero?
The short answer is yes. As I explained a moment ago, it wasn't successful to be in the first two, but it is a reserve project, and we are actively working to make sure it is there in future rounds.
Monaghan, final question.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Over 97% of Scotland's electricity comes from renewable sources. This sector's expansion is hampered not by potential, but by the highest grid connection charges in the UK. COP is an opportunity to reassess such arrangements. So what discussions has he had with Cabinet colleagues on reducing these connection charges?
Well, I regularly meet Cabinet colleagues to discuss these matters and will continue to do so. What I would do is point out the investment my department is making in renewable energy right across Scotland, like the core renewable heat project in East Ayrshire, the tidal energy in offshore wind in Shetland. We are making real investment that will make a real difference to the people's lives and the planet.
Right. Before we come to Prime Minister's questions, I would like